Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals. When you get accustomed to hearing an introduction like I give, it might seem like only words, but I do have a friend or two. I have many enemies, and I know that. And as for the neutrals, those are the people who are in the cemetery and they can't do anything one way or the other. So I just want to include everybody and let everybody know that I'm a nice person, but I'm not sleepwalking. I had mentioned last week that I didn't get to read an article that a guy had written in the title. I don't even use this kind of language, but the word is in the Bible, not in this context, that damn Ernie Chambers. And when people heard that word come out of my mouth, even though it's in the Bible, it shocked them because I'm very meticulous about the language that I use. And there are words that are not a part of my active vocabulary, although I know all of them. And when I was younger, I knew them. And occasionally I would use them and I'd string them together in a way that other people didn't. And they'd ask me to write it down so that they could do it. And I'd say, that's not what we're going to do. In fact, I'm not going to do it anymore. So here's his article. It says, and this was in Omaha Magazine for the July-August issue 2015. And somebody brought it to me about a year ago. That damn Ernie Chambers exclamation point. He's self-absorbed, self-righteous, and infuriating, and he's absolutely necessary. My 88-year-old mother-in-law had never visited the Nebraska state capitol in her 40 years of living in this state. She mentioned this often during a long visit to our home this spring. Quote, "I don't feel like a real Nebraskan," she said. Her visit to our house was extended because she had trouble finding her self-assisted living home she now needs. She mentioned the Capitol daily because rapidly progressing dementia is quickly erasing her memory of even the most recent conversations. So I drove her to that masterpiece of architecture and art, that message to the world that this little state can do big, bold things. I'm a cynic to a great fault, but I still walk the second floor in that Capitol building with pride and childlike wonder. How magnificent. And there's the bust of my hero, Lauren Easley. And then in parentheses, I can feel the graceful, melancholy rhythms of all the strange hours every time I see his likeness. There are the doors of the second chamber of the legislature so boldly sealed. Appropriately, the bust of George Norris is just down the hall. He's the one that engineered the legislature so that it would be one house. As she and I stood in the rotunda amid spastic gaggle of school children, my mother-in-law asked if we could walk over to the legislative chamber that was not shuttered. She heard a voice over the Nebraska Legislature's public address system that drew her to the glass door of the chamber. "I know that voice," she said. "That's Ernie Chambers." Her visit to the second floor of the Nebraska State Capitol was complete. She got to see Ernie Chambers filibustering in the unicameral. There are few people about whom I have a more conflicted opinion. At that moment, the hallway outside the chamber was full of people waiting to get on with the business of the state, but Ernie was inside mucking things up with a diatribe, defending his now infamous earlier comments about Omaha police being more a threat to him and other Omaha Black men than ISIS. Fine, I thought, stand your ground, but get in and get out. You're on the clock here, Senator. At that point, I felt like my taxes were paying for him to once again pleasure himself with the sound of his own voice. Who else in this state is this self-absorbed, this rude? He's the check, my mother-in-law said as she listened. What do you mean? I assumed her mind was elsewhere. The balance, she said. He balances things out, makes people reconsider things. I've always respected that. And so I reconsidered. I always do with Ernie. I considered the times over the last 20 years that I've spoken with him about faulty legislation and likely injustices. He always seemed to be present when something needed questioning. And it wasn't just about North Omaha and African American issues. He once called me to ask if I knew anything about a shady arrest in my hometown of Falls City. Some white woman may have been wronged 100 miles from his district, and he cared enough to make a call to a reporter. The unicameral moves more smoothly than any state legislature in the country, but sometimes things run too smoothly. Comedy isn't always the ideal. That means you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Ernie sometimes serves as the brakeman to a middle-class white guy locomotive that occasionally barrels through the better angels of our nature. And how important has he been to many Nebraskans? Well, for one, my 88-year-old mother-in-law from Hastings, suffering from a form of dementia that makes her forget she's from Hastings, immediately she remembered the lyrical voice of Ernie Chambers and immediately remembered what that voice has meant to her and her state. Ernie's voice echoed through the Nebraska Hall of Fame that day. As my mother-in-law stood there intently watching Ernie increasingly vamp, I imagined these halls on a late night, long past closing time sometime in the future. I saw all the busts come to life, and there was Ernie arguing to the contrary with them all. And that's the man who started out cursing me. What I decided to do, because I've said it's a poor car that won't toot its own horn, is get an article written by somebody else so that it's not me saying I, me, although I know how to do that. But in reading this article, there were things that I had forgotten. It's called the Nebraska Municipal Review, and it's the trade magazine of the various cities throughout the state of Nebraska. And they bring legislation, which I often am opposed to. But they decided it was time to have this article, and it was written in June of 2000. And it's the official publication of the League of Nebraska Municipalities. And you can't read that, and maybe you can just see it without being able to distinguish everything on it. But it says Senator Ernie Chambers, 30 years of public service. And it says about the cover, Omaha Senator Ernie Chambers, 30 years of public service, artwork by Lori Bell, Lowri Bell. And I was elected in 1970. And it starts out with the first page again. You can tell that that must be a picture of me. The importance of being earnest is what they start with. And Oscar Wilde wrote a poem, a play called The Importance of Being Earnest. And Oscar Wilde was very clever, very witty, and one of my favorite playwrights, not just because he wrote that play, but he actually was jailed. He had been to Nebraska, and he was put in jail for homosexuality. It was a crime. And because of the time he spent in jail, he fell ill, and he died, in my mind, prematurely. Looming large on the horizon for anyone. Well, let me read the introductory statement put in this article by the director of this League of Municipalities. Senator Chambers' public service characterized by commitment, controversy, achievement. All history is a record of the power of minorities and of minorities of one, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Clearly, any accurate historical account of Nebraska's unicameral legislature underscores the record of the power of minorities and of minorities of one, specifically Senator Ernie Chambers. The power he has wielded with unequaled passion, precision, and eloquence in the last 3 decades is recorded and indexed in thousands of pages of legislative transcripts, as well as never-ending media coverage. People would ask, and I'm sure they still do, what did you ever do when you were down there? Well, other people knew. If they would have read the newspaper, they would have seen it. If they would have watched the news, there's nobody in the history of the Nebraska legislature who did what I did, who achieved as much as I did, and the types of major issues, who is actually known worldwide. When I filed a lawsuit against God to demonstrate that the doors to the courthouse should be open to everybody, because the Constitution said so, I was going to show that a person has the right to sue anybody, which doesn't mean you'll win, but they cannot cut you off at the courthouse door. And what the legislature was trying to do was pass a law making it a crime for people to criticize agricultural products, among other things. Then somebody saw where a person had spilled hot coffee in his lap at McDonald's, and they quickly wanted to pass a law saying that nobody could even bring a lawsuit for that. And I said, it's stupid what you're doing. First of all, if you pass a law saying somebody cannot bring a lawsuit, that in itself becomes a subject of a lawsuit to determine whether or not his or her case falls under that provision of law, which would prohibit the case. But even to make your law work, if it could work, but it would be unconstitutional. I try to explain things to them like you do to little children in grade school. They are children of a little greater growth. So I would take time, break it down in language that I thought they would understand. And I spent 46 years doing that. The black man, the supposed inferior man from an inferior race, learning their rules better than they did, understanding the Constitution better, understanding their statutes, winning lawsuits. Anyway, I'm going to read the article. The point I'm getting to is that there is work I did in that legislature that nobody had done. So I'm going to make people aware by reading. And if this seems boring, all the people who watch this program from time to time, all 5 of them can go do something else if they choose, but I'm going to put this on record. She mentioned the never-ending media coverage. One lobbyist a year or so ago paid the cost of having every word that I said during that particular session of the legislature transcribed and put in book form. He said he felt that the public ought to have access to everything that I said, and any money derived from it, he was donating it to whatever the cause was. Continuing. Believe it or not, Senator Chambers has represented your views, meaning those who run these cities, because I often had to stand in the way of bad legislation they were bringing. So when she says you or yours, she's referring to the people who operate the cities, who work for the cities, and so forth. Believe it or not, Senator Chambers has represented your views on any number of issues at one time or another during each legislative session. Why? This is because Senator Chambers has been involved in shaping the policy. I emphasize shaping the policy choices on virtually every major issue before the legislature in the last 30 years. Name me any senator anywhere, state or national level, who had a role to play in every major policy that came before that body at that time for 30 years. Name any person who does it now. What did I do? Listen and learn, brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals. Continuing. This is not to say he necessarily supported the legislation, but rather that he exercised his right to use every legislative rule and tactic available to achieve his objective. Senator Chambers lives by Napoleon's creed. If you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna. His effectiveness in doing so is usually to the dismay of many, if not most of his colleagues, not to mention lobbyists. Nevertheless, it is important to emphasize that in almost every filibuster as well as extended debate on substantive issues led by Senator Chambers, there have always been some senators and lobbyists on the same side of the issue silently cheering him on because they're afraid to say anything. Frequently, no one else wants to take the heat that comes with standing in the spotlight, especially when the end of the session is near and time is of the essence. That's when they're in my territory. I tell them, you don't want to go my direction, then this train is not going to move for anybody. I'm the train master. Continuing. The media always seems to credit him or vilify him as the one, quote, wasting the legislature's precious time as the clock keeps ticking away during a filibuster or debate, which will result in other bills failing to pass due to lack of time for consideration. That's my tactic. You're going to mess over my bill, then yours will not even come up. I will take so much time that your bill, even if you got the votes, cannot pass because I've got the roadblock. What did I do? Anyway, many bills introduced on behalf of the League have certainly met their destiny in this fashion. Yet, in fairness to Senator Chambers, it is unlikely that you have read a press account which says, quote, the following senators and lobbyists joined this newspaper in support of Senator Chambers' filibuster to defeat issue X because it also serves our interest to do so. Tough luck to those supporting other bills failing to pass due to a lack of time for consideration, unquote. Even the World Herald said on occasion that they would be silently cheering from the sidelines for what I was doing, but they wouldn't say it openly. Senator Chambers seems to relish his role as master of the rules, king of the filibuster, and of the legislature's consent calendar. The consent calendar is a procedure for expediting passage of bills, which are typically technical or non-controversial. Each one gets only 15 minutes because they don't do anything. They usually, this is what I call the Lawrence Schmidt rule. He's a senator that I got along with. They don't help anybody. They don't hurt anybody. They don't cost anything. They don't do anything, but they need to be enacted for some insignificant reason. And I would even stop that because I would talk up to 15 minutes and the bill came off the agenda and I could speak from 9 o'clock in the morning when we started to 12 o'clock midnight. Nobody had ever done it before. Nobody had said in advance they'd do it, and I would mock them, especially when I got in my 60s. I said, you're going to let a 60-year-old man who never sits down talk this issue to such an extent that you all are lounging in your chairs, or you go into the senator's lounge, or you check out early. I wouldn't let an old man whip me down like that if I was as young as you all are, but that's the way I taunted them. And when they would get ready to leave in a huff, I'd tell them, don't leave yet. I've got more pearls to cast. and some of them knew a little bit about the Bible, which had a verse saying, cast not your pearls before swine. So I could even quote scripture and insult them without using words that in themselves are insulting. Carl Sandburg said that a politician should have three hats, one for throwing in the ring, one for talking through, and one for pulling a rabbit out of if elected. Senator Chambers is famous for pulling legislative rabbits out of the hat at a critical time to expedite the legislative process or effectively stop the legislative process. Sometimes, by his own admission, he has pulled legislative rabbits out of thin air. He is able to do this because his understanding of the legislative process is unsurpassed. There are a few senators who know the rules as well, but even his critics agree that no one knows them better. He is brilliant. He is tenacious. He is controversial. His legislative style is one of such stark contrast that it is frequently disarming and disturbing to his colleagues and others. Yet, his compassion for assisting those in our society who are not in a position to help themselves is certainly shared by many Nebraskans. Since he is involved in virtually every major piece of legislation, you will find yourself strongly agreeing with him on some issues and strongly disagreeing with him on many others. His years of dedicated public service have been characterized by steadfast commitment, controversy, and achievement. Now for the article that was to be written, The Importance of Being Earnest. Looming large on the horizon for anyone seeking to understand the complex dynamics of the Nebraska Legislature is one man. What have I done? No, the question is, where have you been? He is the only Black member of the legislature, and certainly its most controversial, a fact that bothers him not in the least. Since 1970, he has represented the 11th Legislative District, which has more Black people than any other district in the state. At age 62, now that I'm 85, I say at a young, spry age of 62, he turned 63 on July 10th. Omaha Senator Ernie Chambers has some gray in his hair and beard, but otherwise looks remarkably unchanged from photos taken 3 decades ago. He is lean, muscular, and fit. He shuns suits and ties, preferring to wear his trademark jeans and short-sleeve sweatshirts that reveal biceps built through years of weightlifting. He doesn't drink alcohol or smoke, and he often reads and quotes from the Bible, even though he professes not to believe in any religion. And because I say I don't believe in white people's religion, they attach the term atheist to me. If you don't believe what they believe, then they label you. I say, label me anything you want to. You're saying it doesn't make it so. And like kids say, I'm rubber and you're glue. It bounces off me and sticks on you. He has been a tireless, passionate voice in the legislature for 30 sessions, serving longer than any other living state senator. His integrity is unassailable, and his rhetorical style is unmatched. His zeal for society's poor, forgotten, and marginalized is unwavering. His wit and humor are as legendary as his stinging rebukes and filibusters. Effective. When asked to characterize his lawmaking style, Chambers gave a one-word response: effective. Fans and critics alike speak of his mastery of the legislative process and its rules. Isn't that something? Now, I'm supposed to be an inferior man from an inferior race, and I came in and mastered their rules and their procedures better than they did. That's why I had a difficult time being there and remaining civil, but I have self-control and I knew what I was there for, not only to stop bad laws and seek good legislation, but to demonstrate every day that I was their master and their superior. I didn't even have to say it, but sometimes I would. And not one of them would stand to challenge me because I'd make him or her on the spot demonstrate it in our little tete-a-tete right then, and they didn't want that. Quote, I don't give away trade secrets, he said, smiling. Everything I do in the legislature is in a fishbowl. So everybody has the opportunity to watch everything that I do and see how I do it. And they've had a chance to watch me for decades. He compares himself to a capable, successful illusionist. Maybe I'm like Houdini. You can put me in a box and in chains, and when you open the box, I'm gone. Chambers does not have his title and name above the door to enter his office. Only the office room number, room 1107, appears there. As you enter his office, you see stacks of papers, newspaper clippings, file folders, and books heaped everywhere, completely obscuring tables, desks, and chairs. They say, they say a woman is known by her daughter, a man by his son, and all persons by the company they keep. You can look at the kind of things a person gives his or her time to and derive some measure of understanding of what that person is about. And then you see Chambers' well-known weightlifting set. His artwork, mostly protected by brown wrapping paper, leans against walls and bookshelves. If you're lucky, he'll show you some of his drawings, but he does not display them. His longtime legislative aide, Cynthia Granberry, talked about the meaning behind certain elements of a portrait Chambers drew of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Chambers gave Kennedy Onassis green, animal-like eyes and a vampire tooth, which he said symbolizes a harder, far less glamorous woman than was seen in her public persona. And I just happened, leaning against this table, to have that picture. And you won't be able to see the detail, but that is the picture that I drew of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis as I saw her. Oh, I draw pictures too. Wide variety of subjects. During a rare hour-long interview, the always engaging Chambers shared his views on a wide variety of subjects, some of direct interest to municipal officials, including his philosophy about local government and its relationship to state government. Quote, I think local government often gets in the way, and people in the legislature have allowed those local governing bodies and the officials in them to get the impression that they are on a par with the state, but they're not. Chambers said this firmly. They are created by the state, and they have the powers that the state bestows on them, and they carry out some of the functions that the state has chosen to delegate to them, but they are not the equivalent of the state. They do not have the same power to tax or to do anything that the state has. The Nebraska Supreme Court has pointed out that the state creates cities, the state can abolish them. I think that people need to see clearly that the paramount power in Nebraska is the state, and the legislature, being the body that produces laws, is supreme. See, I understand, I explain their laws, their government, the functioning of their governmental machinery that they don't understand. But I say again, the inferior man from an inferior race being the master. And I think somewhere in this article is a quote that I always gave from Mary Shelley's book about Frankenstein. She was a teenager when she wrote that book. She and her husband, Percy Shelley, and George Gordon, Lord Byron, were in this gloomy old castle on a very stormy night. And they decided to tell some ghost stories. So from that came the idea of the Frankenstein story. Frankenstein was not the monster that you see lumbering with his hands out and he cannot speak, he grunts. Well, if he had the brain of a human being, which he did, that brain, once reinvigorated and given life, would understand what it understood, and it would know how to talk. It would know how to understand. So when the doctor, Victor Frankenstein, put these body parts together and got a human brain, this was a very large person, more than 6 feet tall, very muscular, but he was also highly intelligent. He spoke French. And Frankenstein was not the name of the monster. Frankenstein was the name of the doctor. Now, there are things that happen because of his appearance that cause people to hound him. A little girl was drowned, and he tried to save her, and when he got her out of the water and was trying to walk to the city to bring her help, they said he had drowned her and was a monster. And this happens often. He said, beware lest you make me what you say that I am. And he could have been a monster had he chosen to be. He had superhuman strength. He lived in the Alps where there was ice, and he could scale those mountain peaks in the way that a deer could run through the plains, jump over bushes. This was not a stumbling, fumbling, bumbling creature like you see in the movies. Probably the one who put the movies together never read the book. But the statement I'm getting around to is this. He told Dr. Frankenstein, you are my creator, but I am your master. And I'll get to the point where I made that statement. I think it's in this article, but I digress. That means you go off to the side on other issues. I was talking about the legislature creating the cities and they could destroy them. And all those other subdivisions and entities have to be put in their place and kept in their place. They have to show more regard for the state and what its prerogatives are. If the legislators are going to allow themselves to be kicked around by counties, by cities, by school districts, then you're going to have utter chaos, and the legislature will never be able to put together a coherent program of government. I'm trying to explain to these white people how their government should operate. Philosophy understood. Chambers said local government officials understand his philosophy and approach him differently from the way they do other state senators. They don't come huffing and puffing and dictating and ordering me to do anything, Chambers said. Nobody does that to me, but they do it to these other senators, and these senators run scared. That is why people lack respect for the legislature, he said. It's not the things that I do, he insisted. Noting that even his detractors, that meant those who take away from you and criticize you, will come to him for help because they respect his knowledge of the law, the legislative rules, and bill drafting. If I get in a game, as the gambler said, if you want to play the game, boy, you better learn to play it right. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. You never count your money. While you're sitting at the table, there'll be time enough for counting when the dealing's done. When asked to discuss his legislative accomplishments, Chambers declines with a quip, I'm modest, but usually I'm too modest to say that I'm modest. People have asked me, and when they ask me what I've done, I say, well, if you're not aware of anything, obviously I haven't done anything because it did not rise to the level of your consciousness. But she was writing an article based on her knowledge. So she began to write. Among his top legislative achievements was the passage of legislation to provide for district elections for Omaha City Council, the Douglas County Board, and the Omaha Public School District. Before district elections, Blacks were not elected to these governing bodies. He sponsored the resolution in 1984 to impeach Attorney General Paul Douglas, which stemmed from the legislature's investigation into the collapse of Commonwealth Savings Company. The resolution was adopted. Paul Douglas was put on trial before the Nebraska Supreme Court as the court of impeachment. There are 7 members. Under ordinary circumstances, a majority of the judges, meaning 4, will carry the day. When it comes to impeachment, there needs to be a supermajority of 5. So 4 judges voted to convict, 3 voted not to. So because the supermajority was not there, Paul Douglas survived, but I persuaded the legislature to pass the resolution of impeachment. The Supreme Court, a majority, voted to convict him. So I made my point. And these white people were shaking like leaves on trees, by the way. He strongly condemned the practice of apartheid, and that's in South Africa, the discrimination against Black people, and succeeded in passing a statute that called for the state to divest public funds from companies or financial institutions doing business in South Africa. He was later invited to speak before the United Nations Committee about the subject. He also sponsored the legislation that repealed those statutes after apartheid was abolished. I first got a resolution, the first of its kind in the country, and it raised alarm bells in South Africa and led to some other states copying it. And their largest newspaper, the Rand Daily Mail, ran an editorial saying that for this to be done by a Midwestern state, conservative in Nebraska, and they didn't bother to say the only Black member in that legislature brought it, it'll start a bandwagon effect in America that may eventually lead to dismantling of apartheid. That's exactly what happened and led to the dismantling of the racist government. And when Nelson Mandela took over as the first Black elected president, I then got the legislature to repeal all of that legislation that said that there could not be investment in companies doing business in or with South Africa. And once again, the state could invest that money in those companies and it would redound to the benefit of South Africa. So I have an international reputation, and I can kind of understand why people in Omaha would not be aware of the fact that I'd done anything in the legislature and would ask me, what have you done? So in view of what I had done, you can understand why I would say, well, nothing. Anyway, U.S. Supreme Court case. In 1983, Chambers helped bring a case to the U.S. Supreme Court that ultimately resulted in the elimination of a paid chaplain position in the legislature. Volunteers now do the prayer, but this is not satisfactory to Chambers, who wants to see the prayers at the beginning of session each day eliminated. But I got rid of the chaplain being paid, and he stopped being the chaplain, by the way. In 1984, he helped bring a case to the Nebraska Supreme Court to win per diem and expense reimbursements for state senators. Here's how that happened. We could not get expenses during session. For senators who lived a great way from Nebraska, from the legislature, they would have to pay their own expenses while we're in session, and the expenses were very great for them. They had to find a place to stay and all of these other things. So I thought that was ridiculous. And I read the Constitution, and I did not read it to say that senators could not get in session expenses. So I brought a statute that said we could. The governor vetoed it. I overrode his veto. But the Attorney General advised the Department of Administrative Services not to honor the vouchers that I presented. So I said, then the Attorney General has an obligation to challenge the law. And he wouldn't do it. I said, then I'm going to hire private counsel and I'm going to embarrass you again. So then he did his job. But guess what happened? The Supreme Court ruled the way that I argued, the way the language of my legislation said it should go. And senators from the far reaches of the state Those who were there were more grateful to me than they had ever been to anybody, because all those huge expenses were now paid by the state, as they should be. They were legitimate expenses of government, of performing this governmental function. And Nebraska was the only state where they could not get expenses while in session. And their expenses that they received far exceeded the salary, which was $4,800 when I went there. Then it became $12,000 a year. So the senators knew what I had done. New senators who came didn't, because they took it for granted that always expenses should be collectible during the session. So they might ask me, what have you ever done? I said, well, next time you get that expense check, you ask somebody why you got it. But continuing. In 1984, he helped bring a case, and that was where they said I helped bring it, to win per diem expense reimbursement for state senators. It was my legislation that created the right, and my threat to get a lawyer to sue the state was what made them do it. He successfully challenged an Omaha City ordinance allowing for cameras at intersections to catch drivers running red lights. There were people, I'm not going to be able to finish all of this, so I'll be able to work on it and from it for several sessions. And as I say, if it bothers all of those who watch the programs, all 5 of them, then they can stop watching. But my argument was simple. You cannot do this, that this ordinance is attempting to do, because it was creating an offense that went contrary to the state law. The cities could not enact an ordinance like this, which would say that if you violated a traffic law by running a red light, it was no longer a criminal offense. Well, the city did not have the power to do that, and I won't go through all of the details of it, but I wrote a long brief. I cited the Constitution, cited cases, then I argued it in the district court in the city of Omaha, and guess what happened? The judge accepted my arguments because I know the Constitution, I know the law, and I wrote it in the way that a judge would understand it. And I was complimented by those in the legal community who read the brief, and they said, I ought to practice law. I said, I'm doing what I ought to do. What I ought to do, meaning have an obligation to do, is be in a position to speak for the people in my community and the people everywhere who are treated unjustly and unfairly. My watchword will be defender of the downtrodden, and my constituency will be those who comprise the least, the last, and the lost. When they have no place else to turn, nobody who will listen, I'm the man. And those people, when they fell in dire consequences, knew that, and they would come. And as a movie title said, some came running. I'm at that point where I say, as stated the canary, when somebody told him the door to the cage was ajar, I'm out of here, but I'll be back.
Thank you for watching the Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.